Thank you very much, Right Honorable Madam Speaker. I rise to second the motion and with a lot of pleasure. But let me begin by invoking the words of an African-American writer and maybe paraphrasing him, James Baldwin, those who know him. He once said, "Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy of justice." But I want to paraphrase him to say, beauty allied with brain, as the fine lady from Laikipia has just demonstrated, is probably what the doctor ordered for Kenya's economic problems today. Madam Speaker, there's something called state capture. State capture is where decision-making authority is appropriated by individuals and exercised by them, not for public gain, but for private interest. And I think the issue of power supply in Kenya is a classical case of state capture. Madam Speaker, I want to talk about two things: problems of the PPAs, power purchase agreements, and also recommend some solutions as we discuss this important matter. I think the greatest problem today that we face in Kenya with respect to PPAs or power purchase agreements is what we call conflict of interest. The decision makers who have been awarding these PPAs are actually the beneficial owners of the entities that have been given the contracts to supply power. So there is no arm's length in the transactions. We cannot clearly say that there's fair dealings on these matters. There's no transparency because those who are making the decision are the ones who are benefiting, and they are not serving the public interest but private interest. Madam Speaker, bribery and corruption are very apparent in the PPAs that we have signed as a Republic of Kenya. And I speak from historical experience as the person who actually wrote the law that separated Kenya Power from Kenya KPLC and all that, set up the EPRA and the rest. I was the first CEO actually of EPRA, and I have a bit of deep domain knowledge on these matters. But Madam Speaker, the procurement processes, yes, have not been competitive. We have something called feed-in tariff in Kenya, where you just walk in, you negotiate a deal, and you are given a contract to supply power. It is not based on competition. Yeah? It is a good thing to indicate what the tariffs will be, but it must be competitive to get competent suppliers. That is not the case. And there is no competition in most of these things. So we have very expensive sources of fuel instead of using very cheap alternatives like LNG, which I think should have been procured over the years. There are some things that we may not understand because we are laymen, like the long-term nature of PPAs. If you get it wrong at the beginning, you will pay very dearly. There's something called capacity charge or take or pay principle. Those are normal and they are not bad. Yeah? But the problem is we are not matching the demand, established demand, with the supply. So what we have is we have excess supply and limited demand, but we still have to pay the capacity charge. The reason is when somebody puts up a power plant, you must guarantee that their power will be consumed. But if you mismatch your demand with supply, then you will be paying for power that you are not consuming. Those are the problems. Let me go to the solutions. Madam Speaker, I think it is established that there is conflict of interest and corruption in the way the PPAs have been procured over the years. And we have a very classical case in this country, the duty-free case, where a gentleman came and set up duty-free. And then he was kicked out, and then he went to something called ICSID, International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, which is a World Bank entity. Nasir Ibrahim Ali, that was his name, went there and pleaded that he bribed a former president. He gave him a briefcase full of maize. The maize was $3 million. ICSID said, which is the correct position in law, that because your contract was tainted with corruption, we cannot enforce it. But we acknowledge that you are unfairly terminated. I think it is time that this inquiry looks into the PPAs and finds out where there is corruption or conflict of interest. We should vitiate those PPAs and walk away from them. Yes, Kenya cannot be burdened to pay all these expensive PPAs when we know clearly, and it is demonstrable, that there was corruption and conflict of interest. We should also retire the fuel-fired PPAs, like the one in Koru, which is the most expensive in the Republic of Kenya. We should retire it, because to continue supplying power from there at very expensive tariffs is simply to burden industries and the local consumers. Madam Speaker, 20 years ago, we tried to separate transmission from distribution. And that is how KETRACO was conceived. KETRACO was not just supposed to build power lines. KETRACO was supposed to be the transmitter of electricity. And KETRACO was supposed to be in charge of the National Dispatch Center. So that if you separate transmission from distribution and generation, you give the customers the opportunity to select their supplier, where the cheapest power is dispatched first and the most expensive power is dispatched last. So we should enhance or deepen the reforms and make KETRACO what it was supposed to be, not for rural electrification, but for controlling central dispatch system, and then we dispatch power on something called economic merit order. We also need to deal with legacy issues in this sector. We have problems of overstaffing, overstocking, corruption, all those kind of things. We need to deal with this. And finally, Madam Speaker, I think it is time now to look for a strategic investor into KPLC, the way we did with Kenya Airways when it was working, and the way we did with Safaricom, which is still working. Kenya Airways, 20 years ago, when I was a young lawyer, we wrote off 4.5 billion, brought KLM as a strategic investor. And the next 10 years, under the able leadership of the late Ndegwa and Mzee Okero, they made so much money that when Okero retired, Kenya Airways actually had 4.5 billion cash in the accounts, because KLM was able to stabilize the operations of Kenya Airways. I think it is time we got a strategic investor to stabilize the operations of KPLC. You can see Safaricom is making a lot of money because we have Vodafone bringing in the best experience and the best expertise. I think that is the way forward. With those few remarks, Madam Speaker,